Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories taking place not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. As China abruptly dropped its zero-COVID policy, the country faced an unprecedented wave of the virus. Though China stopped providing daily statistics, overwhelmed hospital beds and crematoriums showed a surge in COVID-19 cases. With the surge seen in China, South Korea starting January 5th imposed a new rule mandating travelers from China to submit negative COVID-19 test results before entering the country. Many other countries adopted similar rules, yet while saying such measures are discriminatory, Beijing suspended short-term visa issuance for travelers from South Korea and Japan and even stopped transit visa exemption. Why only South Korea and Japan? Is there going to be an impact on South Korea? For an in-depth analysis on China's visa service restrictions, we invited Arirang's foreign affairs correspondent Choi Min-jung, who has been closely following this issue. Min-jung, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Mason Ritchie, professor at International Politics from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, first question to you, Min-jung. Citing discriminatory entry restrictions against China as the main reason, Beijing imposed visa restrictions on South Korea and Japan. Could you briefly explain to us what exactly they are and when they were imposed?
Right. Last week, China decided to suspend its short-term visa services for South Koreans, and this move was seemingly in retaliation for Seoul's strengthened antivirus measures for inbound travelers from China. The announcement was made last Tuesday by the Chinese embassy in Seoul via WeChat, citing orders from Beijing. And the embassy also stated that the measure will be adjusted depending on whether Seoul decides to withdraw what Beijing calls discriminatory entry restrictions against China. And on Wednesday, Beijing added restrictions saying that it will also require transit visas for South Koreans passing through China on the way to other countries. This is something they were previously exempt from, but now transit visas are needed for travelers who need to stop at a Chinese airport for longer than 24 hours. And China also halted issuing port visas for South Korean citizens as well.
Right. Thank you, Min-jung, for the sum up. Professor Ritchie, the spokesperson of China's foreign ministry, said it was reciprocal measures based on discrimination against China. But is it really reciprocal, or could we really say that it was retaliatory?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying, clearly in my estimation, South Korea's measures are not discriminatory against China, but we can come back to that in a second. It does seem like in some respects the actual measures taken by China are in some ways reciprocal in terms of the diplomatic adjustment of the level of the response taken by Beijing, but the reasons behind it seem to be fairly clearly retaliatory. In the first place, South Korea's entry restrictions are intended to safeguard public health, notably on the import of variants of COVID, given the enormity of the outbreak that has taken place in Beijing since it so suddenly decided to end its COVID-0 policy, whereas China's response has been largely political in nature. And we know that because of the timing of the measures coming just after South Korea's measures. It's also ironically enough, by Beijing, discriminatory in that there are other countries that have imposed similar entry restrictions which aren't facing these types of harsh reprisal measures by Beijing. And then thirdly, I think we should just call it what it is. There's clearly a large element of bad faith here. China had an absolutely restrictive policy not only for its own citizens, but also for citizens of other countries coming into China for the better part of the entire COVID outbreak that we've seen. And if other countries had dared to criticize China's approach to that, it would have found that incredibly insulting. And yet here other countries are facing the same criticism from China. So clearly there's an enormous amount of bad faith on the part of Beijing here.
Right. Professor Ritchie, we need to know that South Korea and Japan were not the only ones that imposed travel restrictions on Chinese travelers. I mean, more than 15 countries have done the similar or the same thing, but South Korea and Japan were the only ones that took the brunt of Beijing's new visa curbs. Why is this?
Yeah, I think there might be a couple of different reasons for that. One of them is that perhaps Beijing is trying to throw its weight around diplomatically, regionally speaking, and so with Japan and South Korea, being out in front in some ways in terms of imposing these restrictions on Chinese entries, that's a convenient way to throw its weight around diplomatically. South Korea's measures are some of the toughest because they do include, the pre-departure test for COVID, an arrival test for COVID, and then they also include the short-term visa block. And so that might be a part of the reason. And then I think the third reason could be simply that Beijing wants to instrumentalize some of the images that are coming out of South Korea. They've used images of Chinese citizens waiting in line for tests or seemingly being singled out, or they've found someone who was waiting in a line from China to come in to get a test, and they were next to perhaps a military officer or some other public authority figure who had a weapon. And I think frankly part of that could be to distract from Beijing's own spectacular failure to manage the COVID-0 policy end. And so showing these images is a way in some sense to direct blame and attention somewhere else.
Right. Now, Min-jung, meanwhile, China has been showing a very different approach to Australia and the United States. Oh, is that right?
Right. The U.S. and Australia are among more than a dozen countries that have imposed restrictions on travelers from China. And while South Korea and Japan were slapped with China's tit-for-tat restrictions, Beijing, as you said, has shown a different approach to these countries by promoting the resumption of flights. Ever since the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020, China suspended most flights in and out of the country, but now most restrictions have been dropped. So last week, China said it's preparing to increase the number of flight routes between China and the U.S. following the lifting of its antivirus measures. And Chinese airlines are also ramping up flights to Australia with hopes of seeing a rapid rebound in travel between the two countries.
Right. Professor, as we heard from Min-jung, it is quite a big difference indeed in terms of how China reacted to neighboring countries compared to others. Some say this is a diplomatic strategy of ensuring that neighboring countries to remain on guard. Could this be the reason, or is it just a proof of an unbalanced relationship each country has with China?
I think it's a little bit of both. In some ways, China looks at China looks at Seoul as a bit of a weak link in some respects. I mean, obviously, South Korea is a very prosperous country. It's a very technologically advanced country, but it is, like many other countries in the region, heavily dependent on China for trade and business. So, blocking these, South Korean travelers from coming into China is a way, in some sense, to put the screws to Seoul a little bit, and perhaps that serves, not only to try to, give a lesson to Seoul, but also perhaps to sort of encourage other states not to take similar types of measures. It's also, of course, a U.S. ally, South Korea is, and I think that this is perhaps, a way to kind of ding the U.S. indirectly, in some sense by putting South Korea in a difficult position where it does need to think a little bit about how to balance its relationship with China versus, for instance, its relationship with the United States. This is just sort of a reminder of that. And then, as I said earlier, Beijing to some degree is simply throwing its weight around regionally. It's done that before. We've had former diplomats from China say very, I think, frankly, over the top things in the past about how China's a large country and it can do what it wants, and small countries just simply have to suffer the consequences of China's decisions. And I think that probably plays a role as well.
Right. Now, Min-jung, the timing of China's such visa restrictions is quite interesting. As far as I know, this came just one day after Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang had phone talks with South Korean counterpart Park Jin, right? What did they discuss?
Well, as you said, last Monday, South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin held phone talks with his new Chinese counterpart to offer congratulations on his recent inauguration. And it was the first phone talks between the two, and both sides reaffirmed their commitment to boosting bilateral relations. And they also discussed pending issues on the Korean peninsula. But the two also touched on issues surrounding South Korea's latest curbs on entrance from China. And the new Chinese Foreign Minister expressed concerns, saying that he hopes that South South Korea would uphold an objective and scientific attitude. And regarding that, South Korea's foreign minister explained that the stronger measures were in fact imposed based on scientific grounds. But regardless, China's suspension of issuing visas came just a day after the call.
Right, so Professor, as Min-jung said, China's suspension of issuing visas came regardless of the phone talks they had with each other. Could we say the dialogue has not been going very well?
Well, obviously, at least on that particular issue, it didn't go the way that South Korea would have wanted it to go, and presumably China would say the same thing. I would say, more interestingly, to sort of zoom out a little bit in terms of context, this is to some degree the first real major or potentially major disruption in Seoul-Beijing relations since President Yoon took office in May of 2022. Much of last year, actually, we saw fairly stable Seoul-Beijing relations, perhaps to some people's surprise. And there were some different reasons for that. Part of it was the lead up to Xi Jinping receiving his third term as chairman at the Party Congress last year. Part of that was the fact that China was still trying to implement COVID-0 policies and was obviously struggling to do so. I think part of it also had to do with the way that the Yoon team managed relations with China, which was relatively non-provocative. And to some degree, we now have all three of those elements that have fallen by the wayside, right? China's COVID-0 policy is over. Xi Jinping is now installed for his third term. And here we have a policy from South Korea, which Beijing has chosen to interpret as provocative. I think what's really interesting going forward is to what degree Beijing's response augurs the future. And I think there's a very good chance that we might see more frequent friction between Seoul and Beijing going forward.
Right, so we'd have to wait and see. Min-jung, moving on to South Korea's reactions, with regard to the suspension of regular visa applications and the shelving of port visas along with the visa-free transit policy, how did South Korea react to this and what kind of measures did it take?
Well, soon after the announcement, South Korea's presidential office and authorities were quick to express regret over China's decision and reiterated there was no choice but to impose travel restrictions on China. Let's take a listen.
President Yoon Suk-yeol says the decision to suspend the issuance of short-term visas for Chinese nationals was solely to protect those here in the country. He has asked the foreign ministry to explain our position to China and said there is no reason for this to cause discomfort in our two countries' relations.
We prioritize the health and safety of people in South Korea. We're aware that the virus situation in China is getting worse, so we had to consider the possibility of a new virus wave or variant originating from China. We had to make this decision because we're one of the countries geographically closest to China.
And to help those who are affected by China's measures, organizations such as the Korea International Trade Association and the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency are taking action. They're setting up online consultation services and providing necessary information for business people who are experiencing difficulties due to the visa situation.
Right. Now, Professor, though South Korean authorities came up with services to offer support for business people in South Korea, there must be an impact that China's such measures could have, not only on South Korean individuals, but also on South Korean economy. Now, what would that be?
Well, as we know, as you said, South Korea is dependent to some degree on China disproportionately, and obviously restricting travel is going to make a difference in terms of finally trying to pick up so many of the broken pieces that happened with all of the closures that took place during the COVID period. That being said, China and South Korea have seen some I won't say decoupling, but they've seen some measures take place to begin to try to de-link parts of their supply chains. Obviously, with what happened in 2017 with the THAAD controversy over the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Battery that was installed here, and China's reprisals against South Korea for doing that. South Korean businesses, have begun at least to learn a lesson over the last 5 or 6 years about how they can operate, outside of their relations with China in some cases, or in some cases to continue to operate in China, but in a way that's more nuanced or more diplomatically easily finessed. So I think that if this type of restriction were to continue going forward, obviously that would present another big challenge. But South Korean businesses as well as the government have some experience now in trying to deal with this type of issue, and of course hopefully these types of restrictions won't last any longer than absolutely necessary as determined by public health measures.
Right. Professor, one more question. Many say the diplomatic spat will not affect long-term ties between China and South Korea, as restrictions will likely be dropped within several months. What is your takeaway on this?
So, I honestly don't have any idea about what's going on in terms of any of the ministries here in South Korea. I think what they're going to do is they're going to be responsible technicians, and they're going to be responsible epidemiologists, and they're going to be responsible public health experts who are going to reach best practices conclusions on when it is that these types of travel restrictions should be removed, and which ones, and at what pace. And presumably, one would hope at least that Beijing would respond in kind. And of course, one hopes that this will happen sooner rather than later, mostly because that would be a wonderful indication that the COVID outbreak in China is under control and reduced, and that the possibility that dangerous new variants that could emerge will be reduced. But among other things, for that to happen, China is going to have to do a better job of sharing information about what's happening in China with respect to the COVID outbreak. And I think that's one of the variables that we don't know in terms of going forward as to when it is that these restrictions can be responsibly taken off.
Right. Now, Min-jung, meanwhile, China brought up the sad issue that has long been the cause of the dispute between China and South Korea. Do tell us more.
Right. The issue has long been a source of tension between Beijing and Seoul. And last Friday, China urged South Korea to continue to handle and manage that issue properly to prevent it from hindering bilateral ties. Now, when a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson was asked to comment on Seoul's preparation of a draft report regarding a THAAD base, the spokesperson said China hopes South Korea will continue to handle and manage the THAAD issue properly in accordance with the consensus on THAAD reached between South Korea's foreign minister and his previous counterpart Wang Yi during their meeting in Qingdao last August. Now, during the meeting, the ministers said they had agreed that THAAD should not be an obstacle to improvements in bilateral relations, but China's foreign ministry a day after declared that South Korea had agreed to limit THAAD operations. Now, South Korea was quick to refute the claim, making clear THAAD is a self-defense tool aimed at protecting people's lives from North Korea's threats and is a matter of security sovereignty that can never be subject to negotiation.
Right. Professor Ricci, what is very interesting is that China is urging South Korea to properly manage the THAAD issue. How is China expecting Seoul to deal with this, and how do you believe our South Korean government should manage this THAAD issue?
Well, I think that what China expects is exactly what Park Jin told Wang Yi last year. That hasn't changed at all. And this formulation of THAAD should not be an obstacle to Seoul-Beijing relations is, of course, quite interesting because we can read that in several different ways, and obviously Seoul reads it in a way that's quite different from the way that Beijing does, and I don't think that that's going to change. In my estimation, Seoul under Yoon must and will make a decision on whether or not THAAD or any other missile defense asset is introduced into the Korean Peninsula entirely on the question of national defense and its national sovereign right to introduce these types of self-defensive measures. They are primarily intended towards defeating potential North Korean missile launches into South Korean territory. And frankly speaking, South Korea should inform China, as I'm sure they already have, under the Yoon administration, that the best way that China can prevent or at least disincentivize South Korea from installing these types of missile defense assets is to put pressure on North Korea to denuclearize. So that's on the one track, and on the other track, South Korea obviously has to continue to work very well with the U.S. military and with Washington, D.C. in terms of shoring up the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And I think that really those are the only two responsible pathways that South Korea can and should take.
Right. Now, Professor, before we let you go, I'd like to ask you, what is also worrying is the negative sentiment that Chinese travelers might have against South Korea, as there were several unidentified claims that travelers from China were subject to insulting treatment upon arrival at the international airport. Of course, South Korean Health Ministry refuted the claims right away, but negative sentiment against South Korea could be escalated if such diplomatic spat would go on. How do you think South Korean government should deal with this?
This type of thing is really hard to deal with, especially as these types of claims, make their way into the internet and to cyberspace, and they take on a life of their own, and they're very difficult to refute. And how one goes about doing that's extremely difficult. Essentially, there would need to be some type of, I would think, public diplomacy campaign coming out of the South Korean ministry, coming out of the South Korean embassy in Beijing, whether that be online or whether that be through other means, and then obviously the embassy in Beijing should make its position clear to Beijing that this type of manipulation of images is unacceptable, and of course, if necessary, you would bring in the Beijing ambassador here in Seoul to speak with the foreign minister, and again make clear directly from Seoul to Beijing through that link that manipulation of images in order to provoke discriminatory behavior and discriminatory attitudes of Chinese people towards South Koreans is unacceptable and ultimately bad for Beijing-Seoul relations now and going forward.
Right. I guess we would have to keep what our professor said in our mind. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor, for your insights. And of course, thank you, Min-jung, for your summary as well. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Have a great rest of the evening, and I do hope everyone enjoys the fresh start of the week. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.